So on that point, I've been thinking about the ways in which, Sri Lanka, and you've written about this, Dharsha, Sri Lanka has begun setting up this office of missing persons, and yet we see that women continue to protest on the streets. So in your mind, what do you think the office actually provides in terms of possibilities for the families of the disappeared? How have families responded to this new office, and how does it differ from Sri Lanka's other and previous sort of war-related commissions? Does it feel different at all this time around?
So this is my personal opinion based on the work that I've done. Different people will have different views on this. But between 1991 and 2013, there were 10 different commissions in Sri Lanka just looking at the issue of disappearances. And the most recent commission was called the Padanigama Commission. It was set up by the former regime. And like all of the other commissions, it was largely staffed. There were huge language issues. People didn't feel like they were being listened to. A lot of people's testimonies weren't correctly, and actually there were issues with translation as well as kind of willful misinterpretation of what these women were saying, women and men. And those experiences have left a huge scar among the families of the disappeared. Alongside that, the government, even though there has been this change of the head, the body remains the same. And when we talk about the change in governance, I think we have to be really careful about what we're discussing. A lot of the kind of pressing human rights issues on the ground still continue. You still see a heavy use of militarization in the North and East. You still have the draconian counterterrorism legislation that's still used in order to arbitrarily and indefinitely detain people. People still haven't got their land back. There's a number of intersecting human rights issues that cause a lot of these families to have very little trust or faith in the sort of leadership. In addition to that, the government themselves continue to make statements to the effect of that, war here will never allow a war to appear before a tribunal. And the question that women have is that you have this new mechanism, the Office of the Missing Persons, or the OMP. And I think you circulated a document that I wrote that does sort of a technical analysis of the flaws of the OMP and the issues with the OMP that make it problematic. But on a very basic level, the issue in Sri Lanka has always been an issue of political will. It isn't an issue of capacity, it's an issue of political will. And given that the Sri Lankan government still hasn't exhibited the political will to actually confront the issue of forced disappearances, to acknowledge the fact that the security forces were largely responsible for most forced disappearances in Sri Lanka, and hold them accountable, there's a real question about how the OMP is going to differ from any body prior to it. The truth is, the only people who really know what happened to a large number of the disappeared persons, and the Sri Lankan government hasn't created any kind of incentive for either of those structures to divulge information about what actually happened, nor have they created the kind of fear that's necessary within those structures for that information to come out. And so we have I think a number of us are reasonably skeptical of the possibilities of the OMP. But that being said, even though the women protesting are similarly very skeptical, and rather than the OMP, what they really want is the list of those who were surrendered and detained. They still have tried to engage to some extent. For a number of them, recently the OMP started soliciting applications for the commission position, their 7th commissioner position. And the families have, some of the families were positions become commissioners. And while we know that it's very unlikely so that the government is actually going to ever appoint somebody who comes from the victim survivor community. It was really important to them that they try and have their voice heard. But we are also getting to a point where we're almost going to cross the line in terms of the level of distrust and skepticism running so deep that people just disengage completely from any system or structure that has to do with the state. And I think that to understand why I'm pretty skeptical of the LMP is there's this analogy that the mothers have told me a number of times. If you have a group of marbles in your pocket, and one of those marbles is mine, all I need is for you to put the marbles on the table to identify which marble is mine. I don't need a system, I don't need a process. And because so many of these women still believe that their children and husbands and wives are still alive, they don't understand why they need a process. For them, it's just a matter of the state releasing these people from, secret detention centers or wherever they believe that they're being kept. And the minute you try to suggest the possibility that actually maybe some of their loved ones, if not most of their loved ones, were probably killed during, after the armed conflict or during the armed conflict by the military, they're just not willing to accept it. And I think that's one of the issues with the resistance to sort of the new mechanism coming forward, seeing it as just another process that still isn't going to give them back their children alive.
Before I turn to Megan, I just wanted to flag a quick housekeeping note. If you have questions, now would be a great time to start writing them. We'll collect them very shortly for the audience Q&A. So Megan, we've talked, you and I, a little bit about the inquiries here in Canada, the one that's ongoing now, the national inquiry here in Toronto. And I know that you're involved with It Starts With Us, which is, speaking to Dharsha's point of people disengaging with the state process. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what it meant for It Starts With Us to start its own alternative community-based database of disappearances.
I'm going to backtrack and find my way back to that.
Okay.
And I'll start by saying that anytime Indigenous peoples have ever relied on state-based approaches or state funding, it's always been a really, really risky endeavor because there's usually a ton of strings attached, whether the state has this kind of narrative that they want Indigenous peoples to reproduce, or if the funding will just abruptly stop. So, for example, when the Native Women's Association of Canada received funds to investigate the disappearances and deaths of Indigenous women and girls, they were able to produce this really shocking number, or this figure that shocked Canada and actually the world. So when they released their Sisters in Spirit report in 2010, it said 600 Indigenous women and girls have gone missing since 1980. It was really jarring because I think most of Canada was skeptical about the claims that we were making, and they thought maybe a couple dozen girls and women had gone missing, but 600 is quite significant, especially when you consider the fact that Indigenous peoples make up 3% of Canada's population. So the proportions are just shocking. Cool. Okay. So after this figure was released, the government just stopped this funding. There was supposed to be a second phase that would continue exploring this, and it was just gone. So that is a risk of state-based approaches. And then, fortunately, there was an independent researcher. Her name was Marianne Pierce, and she did research into missing women as part of her PhD dissertation. And what she found was that she actually doubled the figure that the Native Women's Association of Canada came up with and brought it up to 1,200. And again, this was really embarrassing for Canada. And so what they did in an attempt to dismiss this figure and try and minimize it was they gave a bunch of funds to the RCMP to do their own research. So in 2013, the RCMP released their own report, and in that report insinuated that it was mostly Indigenous men who were causing these disappearances and deaths. And that was a strategy for saying this is an Indian problem and not a Canadian problem. So these are the risks and dangers of relying on the state to investigate disappearances and deaths. So I've been really fortunate to work with some amazing grassroots organizers in Toronto in different capacities, and one of those roles has been with It Starts With Us, and this is a community-based database. We don't accept state funding, and that is because, in part because of these risks, that there's this expectation to reproduce colonial narratives, and that this funding is not reliable, that as soon as anyone breaks ground, the funding will just disappear. I've recently wrapped up Walking with Our Sisters, which was a really significant ceremony that was held here in Toronto in October, and again, this ceremony does not accept state funding, and both of these initiatives are really driven by community. So the funds we receive are by people who really believe in the work that is being done. And because of that, we're able to do the research we want to do and say the things that need to be said without risk of different repercussions.
One of the things that I've been thinking about is how in both Sri Lanka and in Canada, nationalism has been a really important backdrop to these protests. And by nationalism, I don't just mean and I specifically actually don't mean patriotism towards the reigning state, but rather the resistant nationalisms of the communities that are under attack. So conversations, that is to say, about the missing and murdered Indigenous women inquiry here in Canada isn't necessarily a conversation about Indigenous sovereignty on Turtle Island, and the conversation then about disappearances in Sri Lanka in the context of a war, in the context of the war in Sri Lanka, has then also been a conversation about Tamil nationalism and in Sri Lanka. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship in your mind between these protests and Indigenous and Tamil nationalisms? Okay.
Oh, sure. So, I mean, Tamil nationalism in Sri Lanka has largely always been a response to oppression. So since independence, we've seen the growth of Tamil nationalism as a response to discriminatory laws and active oppression by the state. And it's taken different forms at different periods of time. And obviously a large form that it appeared in was during the armed conflict. But even sort of the dominant elected Tamil representatives today, whatever their flaws, and I know a number of us have issues with the party, but it's still a Tamil nationalist party. So Tamil nationalism still continues to dominate the conversation in the North and the East in respect of a political solution, and also in respect of sort of advocacy around the community as a collective. Because the kind of oppression and discrimination by the state that they experienced initially to kind of source Tamil nationalism still continues today. And because Tamil nationalism is this response to oppression, I think that when it comes to sort of activism around disappearances and the families of the disappeared as the political force, they're a huge part of that conversation. As one of the most visible signs of oppression and discrimination that we can see. And I think the other way that they've become a big part of the conversation is that, in the post-2015 environment, and 2015 is when there was a change in the presidency, one of the things that occurred was a little bit of an opening up of space at least respect kind of the something to express. Granted, it's completely understood the military is always around taking photographs, very aware of who's engaged in cities. But in that small window, the first kind of group to actually seize the space and get on the road and start actively doing protests were the families of the disappeared. And in many ways, they sort of opened that door to that kind of resistance. So yesterday, Jaffna University, approximately 2,000 students took to the road in Jaffna to protest the issue of political prisoners. And even though it's more subtle and subconscious than an active conversation saying that, oh, the families of the disappeared have enabled us, the fact that these women have been on the road for now 8-9 months, 270 days as of tomorrow, I think has sort of, inspired a more active type of resistance to state structures and state oppression, which ultimately is the underpinning of Tamil nationalism. So I think it's an important part of the conversation, and I think it's also, worth saying that a lot of these women also actively partake in that conversation. Having lived in, the more affected regions in the country, and having been very much a part of conversations around Tamil nationalism during and after the armed conflict.
Sure. So I identify as a member of the Cree Nation living under colonial occupation. And that means a lot to me. I'm definitely not Canadian. I don't identify as a Canadian. As a colonial subject, there are certain conditions I have to observe because of this ongoing genocide and oppression of my nation and other Indigenous nations. But as far as I'm concerned, Cree nationhood is alive, it is constantly evolving, and it is changing to the different colonial conditions over the last several hundred years, or last 150 years plus the trade. So when I'm thinking of Indigenous nationhood, or more specifically Cree nationhood, I'm not thinking of some idealistic fantasy. I'm talking about a viable framework that is in existence today, albeit limited ways, but nonetheless it is still here. And my people and other Indigenous peoples, we have lost a lot because of what Canada has stolen from us, but we've also managed to keep a lot. We've protected a lot of things from Canada. So I think that when this colonial occupation ends, that we are in a really good position to rebuild Cree worlds, Anishinaabeg worlds, Haudenosaunee worlds. And some of the ways that we are doing that right now is it's really locally based, and it's really rooted in the protocols of the territories that each of us might be on. So for me, living on Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territories for the last 10 years, I've been really blessed to learn about the different treaties that have existed here since even before the arrival of white settlers. So for example, we are in the territories of Dish with One Spoon Treaty, and that is something that I observe, and it's a way that I'm able to always remind myself to give more than I take. I think that my recent involvement with Walking with Our Sisters is a really good example of the ways that we are sustaining Indigenous nationhood. So with that particular ceremony, we're able to draw upon our ancestral knowledges while at the same time bringing in our contemporary everyday experiences.
So my last question for both of you before I turn over to what I will say is like really amazing questions from the audience is just I've been thinking a lot about a specific passage from Anishinaabe scholar Leanne Simpson's new book. And so she has this book out that's called As We Have Always Done, and in it she has an essay called I Am Not a Nation State. And she has this passage where she talks about her understanding of Indigenous nationalism and of Anishinaabe nationalism in particular, and she describes it as one that's tied very closely to the materiality of the land, the physicality of this particular land on which we live in. So beyond the resources of, so she goes beyond the issues of resource extraction and borders to one of care and radical reciprocity. So she has this passage where she says, for my Kobade, which she translates as generations going back and forward, to survive and to flourish for the next 400 years, we need to join together in a rebellion of love, persistence, commitment, and profound caring, and create constellations of co-resistance working together toward a radical alternative present based on deep reciprocity and the gorgeous generative refusal of colonial recognition. This vision for the present has the potential to generate Anishinaabe futures that categorically refuse and reject dispossession and settler colonialism and the violence of capitalism, heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, and anti-blackness that maintains them. To me, Indigenous nationhood is a radical and complete overturning of the nation state's political formations. So again, this is from an essay called I Am Not a Nation State. And I've been thinking about the ways in which both of you have identified the ways that your respective nationalisms are resistant, and that the ways in which they are reaching for what you've described, Megan, as viable frameworks. Can you talk a little bit specifically about the ways in which the nationalisms that ground your work do or do not aspire to state formation? And I think that has looked very different in the Indigenous context on Turtle Island versus the Tamil context in Sri Lanka, which has been about the pursuit of a new state. What does that mean, for example, in the context of gender that we've talked about and sort of like overthrowing patriarchy, but also in the context of like capitalism? So Leanne Simpson talks a lot in this book about the violence of capitalism and how that has been foundational to the creation of Canada, and how her understanding of Indigenous nationalism is inherently, even leaving aside the issue of colonization, is inherently anti-capitalist. What does that conversation look like in Sri Lanka, if at all? Like, is that possible? Are these conversations that are happening? How can we bridge those maybe different political framings across these different contexts?
Okay, everything Leanne Simpson said. That's it. No. I think Cree nationhood is radically different than Canadian nationhood, and I'll start with two obvious examples, or two examples that are really obvious to me. And so the first one is the political boundaries are remarkably different. So with colonial boundaries, they're very rigid and very separate. Like, this is mine and that's yours, and we can't share. So you have Canada, the United States, Mexico. But with Indigenous political boundaries, there's a lot of overlap. And even though there's overlap and there's shared grounds, that doesn't make it any less significant or less real, and it's definitely not more flimsy. It's just a different way of conceptualizing and thinking about land. Because within Western frameworks, land is always turned into property, whereas with Indigenous nations, it's more about having a relationship with it. And I mean, maybe it's a little polyamorous that like the land is in a relationship with several nations at once. So that's one of the more obvious examples that comes to mind. Another example is around citizenship for me. So for Cree people, it's organized around this principle called kuduin, which is taking care of your family. So for us, it's around kinship ties and relationships. So back in the day, that might have looked like marriages or something like that. But I think for me, if I was going to practice Wukuduin in the context of my life right now, I would want it to look like, super fucking queer. And that would mean having chosen family, and that would mean the people who have come into my life and help support and honor my existence.
Dharsha, do you have any comments?
I mean, I love the passage that you shared. And I think to me, what it signals is actually we have quite a lot to learn from Indigenous nationalisms and the ideas that underpin them. I think the conversation in the Sri Lankan context with respect to Tamil nationalism is an evolved conversation. So obviously the form that Tamil nationalism has taken for a very long time is an aspiration to a separate state. And, there are reasons for that reasons that continue to exist today. But I think that, given that the armed conflict has ended, at least in the country, nobody is publicly advocating for a separate state anymore, but rather asking for a political solution that respects and acknowledges the notion of a Tamil nation, which is very much tied to geographical boundaries. So the concepts of land of things within Tamil culture and Tamil society are very different than land that Megan has just spoke of. But I think that they raise sort of interesting questions for our struggle and society here as well to think about. But I think the one conversation that really is happening here is, and maybe it is happening within pockets and happening at the activist level and also at the university student level, is how when we talk about Tamil nationalism now, we address other kinds of oppression internal to the community. So Tamil nationalism is a response to oppression from the Sinhala state. But then within the community, we know that there are multiple intersecting layers of oppression, whether it's respect to gender, caste, class, and the conversation of how to build Tamil communities and Tamil identity in a way that is responsive to those kinds of oppression and addresses those kinds of oppression is being taken seriously now, I think. It hasn't yet permeated the political level yet, but those conversations, like for example, we run a small program with university students at Jaffna University. And when we started the program, I was a bit nervous about bringing up issues of caste, class, intersectionality, gender, because I wasn't sure how the students would respond, and most of them are either from Jaffna or from other disciplines north. But to my surprise, when we asked them on the first day raise issues that they saw as extremely important, a large number of them raised gender inequality and caste-based discrimination. And so I think that, to me, that's an extremely positive step, this rethinking of Tamil nationhood, Tamil nationalism, as a form of identity, as a form of a movement that is actually more holistic, and seeing it as something that encompasses a broader grassroots-based idea of community. Some of that work has been done for years and years. And even during the armed conflict, the LPT did take positions on this, as well as other Tamil political parties. But I think in the sort of the post-armed conflict phase, those conversations are now, but we have a long way to go. And I think we have a lot to learn from the kinds of nationalism that communities in Canada are thinking, like looking at that passage you also said.
So Megan, a question from the audience for you is, can you talk a bit about the mobilization on the international level? What, if any, have been the benefits?
Sure. There has been a ton of benefits as a result of moving beyond state-based recognition. So for example, earlier I talked about the women of Toledo First Nation. So when their case made it all the way to the Supreme Court and it got shot down, And when that happened, they went to the United Nations Human Rights Council. And what this did was it put Canada up on the global stage, where they were embarrassed because this is supposed to be one of the friendliest, most developed countries in the world, yet it was committing this really obvious form of gender discrimination. And again, international approaches were really useful in 2004. Amnesty International released No More Stolen Sisters, and this was a damning report that detailed state-sanctioned sexualized violence over many decades, and this report even talked about the different ways that state actors colluded in this violence, so how police were committing violence and judges and all this kind of stuff. So again, Canada was put under this global microscope and forced to respond to it, and I think because of this report, it kind of put pressure on Canada to at least act like it was addressing it. So I think that might have led to maybe the Sisters in Spirit funding for a little while.
Dharsha, this next question is for you. Is Tamil diaspora politics dominated by men? And if so, what role have women played in the Canadian-American protests?
I don't know who's in the room, so. But Tamil diaspora politics, as most of us know, has been, yes, largely dominated by men in my experience. And I think the thing is, there needs to be a more meaningful inclusion of women. So even when I have worked with Tamil diaspora organizations, what I've found is that everyone's happy to have women kind of at the front, right? Like doing advocacy or doing activism. But what they don't like is when women start to try and get engaged in decision making. And I think that kind of culture of what those kinds of leadership roles and the decision-making roles women are allowed to have, or not allowed to have, but the space that's given for women needs to be expanded significantly. And I think, and this is a cultural thing, so it's not just restricted to sort of diaspora politics. I think it's in all kind of facets of the diaspora as well, particularly on issues pertaining to back home from the north and east, from Sri Lanka, or even within the diaspora community. There is a long way to go, I think, in terms of meaningfully including Tamil women in those political spaces and creating spaces that are accessible for women, where women feel safe to participate and feel like they can participate without being discredited or kind of sidelined. I mean, one of the things that many women, including myself, have experienced in trying to work with is that if you speak up or if you voice certain kind of policy or you try to influence decision making, you're almost immediately labeled just troublesome or problematic. The words that they use, that they would have to describe some of them, they fought really hard to create spaces for themselves in these organizations and also outside of these organizations. So I also want to respect that knowledge that there are a number of really great Tamil women who work in diaspora organizations. But it's not easy, and I don't think these spaces are fair and acceptable.
Megan, the next question is for you. The ongoing colonial project maintains existing systems of oppression that marginalize both minority and Indigenous communities in Canada. However, in a paradoxical way, the dispossession of Indigenous land unfortunately often benefits immigrants. How can we reconcile this?
I think in order for Canada to exist, as I said earlier, Canada needs settler colonialism, needs anti-Black racism, and it needs to commit violence against migrants. That is how Canada exists. So I think different communities have benefited in a lot of different ways. But ultimately, I do think that our oppression and our liberation is all bound up together. I think one of the ways, and I want to change the question a little to say, how can we reconcile this? So I think one of the ways that we can reconcile this is, I'll start from where I am, is that I think a lot of times because of settler colonialism, Indigenous peoples are afraid because they trusted so much at one point and were so deeply violated in a structured way that's still ongoing. So as what I do in my own community is I try to do work that resists xenophobia, for example. And I think one of the things that, in order for us to have meaningful relationships, that is Indigenous peoples and migrants, is that I think what Indigenous peoples need is just is maybe just being a little bit more critical about Canada's myth. You know, this myth that it is this friendly, multicultural place that is so benevolent and just don't buy into it. Don't drink the Kool-Aid. I don't know. This is a big question, and I don't think that I can really answer it as well as it needs to be answered right now, but I hope we continue having this conversation to think about it.
And I, as I was asking you that question or reading it out, I did want to add that it is a very large question, and it feels in some ways less a question for Megan than like a conversation for us collectively to have with each other in this room. So, you know, thank you for being in this room, and hopefully continue this conversation, you know, as we go forward. Dharsha, this next question is for you. Aspirations for the separate state of Tamils in Sri Lanka have been violent towards marginalized communities in Sri Lanka. For example, Muslim Tamils, indigenous nomadic nations on the island, and more. How can Tamils and the Tamil movement be more inclusive and cause less harm to those most marginalized?
I think that's a really important question, and I think it's a question that is being discussed within communities here. And I think that, at a fundamental level, concept of Tamil nationalism, I think, needs to be disentangled from Tamil patriarchal structures and male-dominated spaces, which is currently where they reside in the political sector. Because I think that when you remove them from those spaces, it's easier to have these conversations. And I also think that one of the very problematic ways that Tamil nationalism has failed to kind of address these other issues of how the Tamil nation is marginalized certain communities, and then how within the Tamil communities there's marginalization, is this kind of something that I hear sometimes is, okay, but first let's address the oppression by the state, and then we can address all these other issues. And I think that there are kind of flawed ways of approaching community building, identity building, or nationalism. And I think that in particular, respect of the Muslim community, the context is obviously very different, north versus east. But I think as something, I personally take a lot of interest in, there's a lot that the Tamil community in the north has to do in respect of the Muslim community in the north to be able to, within these communities, also think about reconciliation and accountability and moving forward, and how sort of the Tamil nation can be built in a way that is less oppressive, and also addresses marginalizations within it. So I think it's a really important question. I can't answer it as an individual, but I mean, that's sort of my personal view on it. But I think within the diaspora as well, because one thing I have found is that it's actually easier to have those conversations here, like in the north and east, than I found it to have it in the diaspora. And maybe I think things are changing, and I think part of that is a generational issue as well. But I think that the diaspora, if those conversations were also being had much more public and leadership in the diaspora, it also be easier to have conversations here as well, or that we support the conversations that are happening here.
Megan, a question for you. Why is the current national inquiry in Canada failing to make substantial change?
Why is the current failing to? Let me think about it. Anonymous question. I think making substantial change would undo the state. So Canada is deeply invested in maintaining systems of oppression, including gender violence. So to really meaningfully address the reasons why Indigenous peoples are disappearing and dying, what was I saying?
Undo the state.
Yeah, it would undo the state entirely. So that is why.
So like a lack of systemic response.
Exactly. So I think really what this inquiry is actually doing is it's producing a narrative that absolves Canada of responsibility. That's what this inquiry is really about.
A question for Dharsha. Are the people who are being disappeared the same that are protesting signalization and land occupation in the Northeast?
I mean, and I think this is the point I'm trying to make, right? That you can't compartmentalize these things. So the families of the disappeared are part of a larger Tamil community. And as people who actually show kind of the courage, right, to have their voices heard, they don't just isolate themselves to advocating on their issues. And so they participate as well in protests around land and signalization. But those protests have also broadened to include other people as well. So particularly with respect to land, you'll find the communities affected by land displacement are obviously leading those protests. With respect to civilization, it's a little bit more complicated, but the protests were being led in the north by a sort of larger political, civil society movement. But these communities are very much intertwined, and I think if there's one thing that everyone in the room could really think about, or rethink about when it comes to families of the disappeared, is that we shouldn't try to fit them neatly into the box of victim survivors. Since you're a mother of the disappeared, that's all you are. I don't think that's how we should approach these things. The fact that this person is a mother of the disappeared means that they've suffered significant trauma and experienced a horrific atrocity. But they've also survived that atrocity and are now advocating for truth and justice around it, and are an important part of the broader Tamil community. And so they have just as much of a right as all of us to partake in these political processes and have an identity that goes beyond just their sort of victim survivorhood.
So I'm going to take us to two more questions. For Megan, how does the child protection systems here in Canada interact with the disappearances in Canada? Are there numbers for how many kids disappear from state care?
I don't have those numbers on me. Maybe. So I don't have the numbers, and I don't really care about the numbers, to be honest. Just because I don't think there's this threshold that we have to reach where it suddenly matters. So for me, it didn't matter that 600 Indigenous women and girls were killed, murdered, and disappeared, because one is enough. And I think the same about the children who are disappeared within this child protection system. What I do want to say about this structure is that this is a really good example of how we can think about gender violence as being structured. So with the close of residential schools, we saw the rise of this child welfare industry. And in the 60s, we have what's commonly known as the 60s scoop, where children were just removed from their homes, like en masse. A lot of them were sent to white families across Canada, the United States, and even Europe, and never told that they were Indigenous. So there are people living in this world who are disappeared and they are alive, and their identity is denied from them. Today, there are, Cindy Blackstock has said there are more Indigenous children in care now than at the height of the residential school era, so I think that's significant. There are definitely gender dimensions to this system. So for example, a lot of the children who are in care, they're not placed into foster homes anymore. They're held in hotels in cities. So there might be a whole floor at the Delta, or probably not the Delta, like a Super 8 or a Super 6 of just children in rooms, and maybe there's one staff for that floor. And what happens in these arrangements is that maybe a girl goes outside to the parking lot for a cigarette, and then maybe she never comes back up. A lot of times these situations are just so deplorable that girls will run away. Two-spirited children will run away because they just can't stand it there anymore. And they never get where they intend to go.
So this last question is about what next. So December 6th, here in Canada, is the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women. What can we do as individuals to honor this day? What can we do as community organizers to raise awareness and take meaningful action? Thank you for all the work you are doing and for organizing this event. Do either of you want to start?
You want to go first, Dharsha?
Sure. I mean, I think that the issue of violence against women, it goes beyond just disappearances, obviously, and there are multiple ways in which women have experienced violence in Sri Lanka and continue to experience violence in Sri Lanka. And obviously, it's up to communities in Canada how they choose to commemorate that day, but in terms of ways in which support can be provided, I think the kinds of protests that are happening here, as well as the kinds of resistance that's happening there with respect to violence against women. I think one of the things that we should think about is the different ways, the intersecting ways in which women experience violence here. So I'll just tell a short example. There's a woman I know from Bataglo. Her husband was disappeared during the last phase of the armed conflict. She's very young, 31, I think. She has a son who is like 3 or 4 years old. And so she's an ardent activist when it comes to disappeared issues. She has gone from, according to her, she's been to every military camp in the north and the east to try and find her husband. She's also attended government office after government office trying to find answers about her husband. And in this process, she's not only subjected to the violence that she experiences on a daily basis as a result of that disappearance, but also the sort of the violence of being a single mother in a very patriarchal system, trying to engage with all the positions of power. Recently, there was a study done that showed that there were over 20 cases of sexual bribery, which is a term that's used here, but it refers to when officials in power use coercion, vulnerability to extract sex or sexual favors in return for services that they're supposed to provide, which in Canada would be called sexual assault. And so I think that there's multiple different ways in which women experience violence in the north and the east that I've seen or explicitly exposed to. And I think there are lots of ways that the Tamil community and other communities can kind of try and find solidarity with women here and the kind of violence that's happening here. But I do think in terms of organizing, sort of one way that is really important is the fact that right now there's a lot of pressure in Sri Lanka to address issues of gender-based violence. And actually, this year, Sri Lanka was reviewed by the Committee on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women at the United Nations. And one of the recommendations made was that there needed to be a special office set up to look at issues of gender-based violence in Sri Lanka. And this is something that advocacy is being done on. And then I think just more broadly, when we talk about Tamil politics, talk about Tamil activism, acknowledging the kind of resistance that's being led by women and ensuring that it's their voices who are being heard and not just sort of the typical Tamil male politicians or even Tamil male civil society. Yeah, I don't know if that answers that, but I hope that was helpful.
Thank you.
So some of my initial thoughts are, and I'm going to answer this in two parts. So first, the first part's I'm speaking to Sri Lankan diaspora community members and other communities of color. So I think we need to find ways to show up for each other and break out of these silos that Canada has put us in. We need to stop thinking about our issues as being separate because they're not. They're so intertwined, and if we keep working on our own, I don't think we're going to find the liberation and the radical change we're looking for. But in order to do that, we need to take care in negotiating these relationships, and that means feeling comfortable with the complexities and the tensions that will come up. Understanding that there are different incommensurabilities, and even though we often share a common colonial or imperial oppressor, that the violence that we're going to experience as different communities will look different and will happen for different reasons. So that's something that we need to keep in mind. I'll quickly tell you an embarrassing story that I'm a little ashamed about, but I'm going to do it anyways. So when I was younger and I didn't know any better, I used to listen to other people's stories of oppression and violence, and I would think about all the ways that my story was the same as theirs. But the thing is, it wasn't, and it can't be. I think that we don't need to always seek change or seek similarities to understand each other. I think it's important that when we come together, we need to be mindful of what we ask of each other. So a lot of times if I'm with friends who aren't Indigenous, I'll say, is this a question for Google? Do I really want to put this shit on my friend who's already carrying a lot of emotional labor and burden? And also there's things that we don't need to know about each other. There's things that I don't need to know about my friends unless they want to tell me. And there's things that they don't need to know about me unless I want to tell them. Sometimes well-meaning people will ask me about different Indigenous traditions and cultures, or ask me to speak my language without realizing this is a deeply hurtful and painful question, because it calls into the room all this colonial violence and fracturing that has happened to my body and my community that I suddenly have to account for. I have to tell you why I don't know how to speak a full sentence in Cree, and I have to package this this knowledge for you. And the thing is, I don't want to turn sacred knowledge into a fun fact for you. So let's think about that. And at the end of the day, it's about land. It's about materiality. It's about, it's about the dirt and the grit. So let's continue to do land acknowledgements because that matters. We're calling land into the room when we do it, and it's really fun to hear white people say it when they don't want to. But let's accompany that with the actual dirt and soil and water and air. And the second part of this address is to white settlers. And all I have to say is, stop killing us and give us back the land you stole. That's it.
I'm not going to add anything to that except to say thank you both so much, from Jaffna and from the Cree Nation, from both of these obviously overlapping and distinct contexts. Thank you for demonstrating what solidarity can look like in a really meaningful way. Thank you all for being here, for making this conversation possible, right? It literally could not happen except that you are in this room with all of us together having this discussion. So thank you. I anticipate our next session will be in January, TBA. To that end, we have a sign-up sheet, and we will send out updates, and we look forward to staying in touch going forward. Thank you.